What if the problem isn't that you're bad with money? What if you're just following the default path most people take, and that path quietly leads to financial stagnation over time? Being normal today often means your income and expenses move at the same pace. There is no real margin, only constant balancing over a long time horizon that creates hidden financial risk. You scroll and see people upgrading their lives. Vacations, new cars, better apartments, it all looks effortless. But what you are seeing is a curated snapshot, not the underlying volatility. What rarely gets shown is the financial pressure underneath. Credit balances growing, savings barely compounding, stress building quietly. This is not rare, it is statistically common. This is the margin where we look at the numbers people avoid. No hype, just simple math and real patterns. By the end, you will see where you actually stand financially. Let's start with the most basic variable, income. The median salary in the U.S. is around $52,000 per year. It sounds stable until you actually examine what that number represents over time horizon. That number exists before taxes and deductions. Once adjusted, the usable income drops closer to $35,000 to $40,000. The gap introduces an early drawdown most people never account for. On a monthly basis, that becomes roughly $3,000. That amount needs to cover living costs, debt, and any attempt at long-term compounding. If it feels tight, it is because the margin is already thin. And remember, this is the median point. Half of workers earn below this level, often facing higher volatility in expenses. So if you feel behind, you are statistically within range. The issue is not just income size. It is the expanding gap between wages and real living costs. That gap compounds quietly over time. You are expected to build savings, invest, and eventually own assets, all while operating within a narrow margin and uncertain risk environment. It starts to resemble a system under structural pressure. Yet culturally, this situation is framed as normal. People continue operating within it without questioning the structure. The system appears stable on the surface, but internally shows volatility. So this is not just about effort. It is about where the baseline begins and how limited the initial margin is. And this is only the first layer of the system. Now let's look at where the money actually goes. The average household spends around $5,500 per month. And if you pause for a second, something about that number feels off. Income sits around $3,000 a month for many people. Spending is closer to $5,500. That gap is not a mistake. It reflects a structural imbalance over time. Housing alone takes around $1,800 on average. Transportation adds another $900. And at this point, basic survival already consumes most of the budget. Groceries add roughly $700 more each month. The numbers keep stacking quietly in the background. And suddenly there is very little room left to breathe. The issue is not excessive spending behavior. The baseline cost of living has shifted upward over time. Even a normal lifestyle now carries higher long-term pressure. There is no luxury here, no extreme purchases, just housing, food, and basic mobility. Yet the financial pressure still builds with quiet consistency. At this stage, many people reach for a common tool. It does not solve the imbalance, but it delays the impact. That tool is debt. When the numbers do not align, the system provides a way to continue. But that continuation comes with increasing long-term cost. And over time, the compounding effect becomes harder to ignore. The average credit card debt sits around $9,000. It is not used to build assets or increase long-term value. It mostly funds consumption that has already passed. With interest around 20%, the cost adds up quickly over time. That means roughly $1,800 a year goes to interest alone. You are paying just for the ability to stay in debt. This money does not improve your financial position over the long term. It does not compound into anything meaningful for you. It simply increases the bank's returns while you experience the drawdown. This situation is not rare or extreme. It reflects what is considered financially normal today. And that is what makes it difficult to notice. Much of this debt does not come from emergencies. It builds from small lifestyle choices that feel harmless in the moment. Over time, those choices accumulate into something heavier. The issue is rarely one large decision. It is the accumulation of many small ones over time. And many of them are quietly financed by debt. At this point, you are no longer just using your current income. You are borrowing from your future time horizon. And it happens gradually, almost unnoticed. This is often mistaken for financial flexibility, but it is actually a delay with a cost attached. And over the long term, that cost compounds quietly. Now, let's move forward in time for a second. The median retirement savings sits around $65,000. It sounds reasonable until you actually run the math. If you apply the 4% rule, the output becomes very small. That amount turns into roughly $2,600 per year, which is only a few $100s per month. Be honest with yourself for a moment. Could you realistically live on that number today? Even basic groceries would already push those limits. And remember, this number includes all age groups. That means many people close to retirement are in this position. The timeline doesn't fix the gap. It gets more concerning when you look deeper. Around a quarter of people have nothing saved at all. Not low, not small, but zero. So the fallback becomes a single system. Social Security becomes the expectation. Even though its long-term clarity is still uncertain, this creates a quiet but important pattern. People work for decades across long time horizons, yet still arrive at a place that feels financially fragile. When you put it all together, the picture becomes clearer. This is not really a retirement plan in the traditional sense. It functions more like a survival plan at an older age. The median net worth is around $122,000. That sounds solid at first glance, but the distribution behind that number is highly uneven. If you are under 35, the median drops sharply. It falls to around $14,000. That is barely enough to absorb even a small shock. This means one unexpected event can erase progress. A medical bill or job loss is enough. In many cases, there was no real cushion to begin with. Most of that net worth is not liquid. It is tied up in housing or long-term assets, and those are not easily accessible in urgent situations. On paper, they own assets. In reality, they cannot use them quickly. There is a clear gap between ownership and usability. This part rarely gets discussed. Wealth on paper does not equal real-world stability, especially when volatility enters the picture. From the outside, everything looks fine. Income, assets, normal lifestyle. But underneath, the margin for error is extremely thin, so the real question is not your net worth. It is how resilient you are to financial shocks. And for many people, that resilience is still missing. When you zoom out, the pattern becomes clear. Income moves slowly while expenses move faster. Over time, that gap quietly increases risk in your financial life. When the gap grows, most people don't stop spending. They borrow to maintain stability in the short term. Debt becomes the bridge between reality and lifestyle. The system doesn't break when you borrow. It actually works exactly as designed. It rewards continuous participation, not exit. Banks earn through interest over time. Companies benefit from ongoing consumption. You carry the mental load in the background. All of this is labeled as normal. It feels familiar, so it rarely gets questioned. The system blends into everyday life. But if you look at it objectively, it's not stable. It's a constant balancing act under pressure. Small shocks can create noticeable drawdowns. Most people don't see the system clearly. It feels like everyday life, not a structure. Awareness often comes late, if at all. This system doesn't necessarily help you move forward. It often keeps you in the same position over a long time horizon, and that's why progress can feel slower than expected. The good news is simpler than you think. You don't need to be exceptional to improve your financial position. You just need to stop following the average path. If the average person saves around 6%, the bar is not that high. A small increase already changes your long-term trajectory. Compounding quietly rewards those small differences over time. If the average relies on consumer debt, Avoiding it already reduces your risk exposure. Less debt means less pressure during volatility or income changes. Sometimes progress is simply not stepping into common traps. This is not about intelligence or timing the market perfectly. It is about repeating simple actions with consistency. Over a long time horizon, consistency beats intensity. The issue is rarely that the goal is too ambitious. It is usually the small habits that quietly break the system. Tiny repeated decisions shape the outcome more than big intentions. Slightly more awareness changes how you spend. Slightly more discipline improves how you manage risk. These small adjustments compound quietly over time. Over time, these small differences are no longer small. They create distance between two completely different financial lives. What looks minor today becomes meaningful later. In this system, speed is not the advantage people think it is. Avoiding unnecessary drawdowns matters more than chasing quick gains. The ones who step out of the flow tend to last longer. If there's one thing worth remembering, it's this. Being average isn't a goal, it's a signal. In most cases, it quietly points to long-term financial risk. The uncomfortable truth is simple. Most people are not moving toward financial freedom over their time horizon. They are slowly adjusting to financial pressure instead. These numbers are not meant to create fear. They exist to give clarity about risk, volatility, and long-term outcomes. Awareness simply gives you more control over your next decision. You can keep following the default path, or you can pause and reevaluate your system with more honesty. That small shift can change how compounding works for you over time. If you want to see the side of money that rarely gets explained, this is where we continue. No hype, just numbers and long-term perspective. Subscribe to The Margin if that's what you're looking for.